Hi everybody, welcome to our last lesson on the Great Fire of London. Well, our last learning lesson. Our next one is a quiz. So this is the last time we're going to learn anything new about the Great Fire of London. And today we are having a think about how did they put the Great Fire of London out? If there was a fire today, who would you call? If there was a fire today, you look around, you saw a house on fire or your house was on fire, who would you call? Have a minute to think about it. And let's have a look. So if your house was on fire today, you would call 999 and ask for the fire brigade, who would come in their fire trucks that look like this, with their blue flashing lights. They're big with lots of water in and their hoses and things like that. How would the fire brigade that we see today put out a fire? What would they use to put out a fire? Let's see. They would use big hoses, and there's lots of water stored in the back of these, and the big hoses come out and they've got all their protective equipment on, and they would use those hoses to spray water all over the fire to help put it out. Do you think that in 1666 they had fire engines like this and fire hoses like that? What do you think? Do you think they did or they didn't? They didn't. They did have a form of fire brigade, but of course they had fire trucks, but they weren't like our fire trucks today because they didn't have cars or things like that, and they didn't have hoses. So how did the fire brigade in 1666 try to put out the Great Fire of London? So one of the things they used were these water squirters, which were filled with water and squirted at the fire. Kind of like, has anybody ever had the water pistol that you pull it back in water and it fills up with water, and then you lift it up and you squirt it out and it squirts water far? That is what those are. So they'd have to have water from buckets, squirt them up and squirt them at the houses. The problem with this is, do you think one water squirter held much water? Probably not much. And if the fire is as big as the Great Fire of London, is it going to make a massive impact? Not really. So the one thing they used was water squirters to squirt it out, but probably didn't make that much of an impact. Another thing they had were leather buckets. So these are what the buckets look like. And they were filled with water, and the water was thrown at the houses. Some people that even weren't the fire brigade helped to try and put the fire out by filling buckets and throwing them at houses. Some of these buckets were used to fill the water squirters up, but it was the only thing they had to store water in. So they would fill up the buckets, throw them at the houses. Another thing they had is these things called fire hooks. And what they did with these fire hooks is they actually pulled houses down. So if there was a row of houses, they pulled some of the houses down. And the reason that they did this was to create gaps between the houses. So for example, I will draw you a little diagram. If the houses were like this, dun, 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 the houses are all really close together. But if they used the fire hooks, and then that means the fire could easily pass from house to house. But if they used the fire hooks and they pulled some houses down, oh dear, I've just managed to break my pen by overexcitedly colouring in. Say they pulled these two houses down. Can you see that there are now gaps between the houses? So it's harder for the fire to spread from house to house. It can't spread as easily when there is a bigger gap in the middle. So that is another thing they did. And sometimes the fire hooks weren't just enough, so they had to think of another way to create gaps in between the houses, and that was by using gunpowder to blow up the houses to create gaps. So just like my diagram here, but instead of pulling the houses down, they actually used gunpowder to blow up the houses to get rid of the houses to create gaps between them. So we had 4 ways that the fire was put out. So they used water squirters, filled it up, squirted it at the fire. They used leather buckets, which are filled with water, and threw them out at the houses, but obviously it was only whatever you could hold. They used fire hooks to pull the houses down to create gaps between the houses so the fire wouldn't spread so easily. And they used gunpowder to blow up houses to create gaps between them. Obviously, they would have made sure that people were out of the houses beforehand. A good thing of the Great Fire of London, when I'm talking, I know all this sounds a bit scary, is that in the whole massive fire that spread through most of London, only 6 people passed away. So only 6 people lost their lives. It is incredibly sad that those 6 people lost their lives. But considering the size of the scale of the fire, it was a positive outcome that there weren't more deaths. So 6 people lost their lives in the Great Fire of London. So before they did things like pull houses down and blew up houses using gunpowder, they obviously made sure that people were out of the houses so as to not put them in any danger. So that is our final bit of information about the Great Fire of London. And what you are going to do for your activity today is to create a poster about what you have learned about the Great Fire of London. So you have got a template like this, but you don't have to use that if you don't want to. It is just an idea to get you started. And in the middle, it says, what have I learned about the Great Fire of London? And then this arrow says what was different about houses, who was Samuel Pepys, how was it put out, and why did it spread? So I've put 4 things for you to think about, and I will show you the sort of thing that I have done. So I have done the first part of my post. I have done what was different about houses, and I have drawn a picture of what the houses looked like in 1666 and written some short statements about how the houses were different in 1666 than they are now. So you might like to do it like that. You could draw more pictures. You can look back on your work to remind yourself, and then you would do the same for your Samuel Pepys learning until you have got a whole poster. So it's up to you how you design your poster, and I can't wait to see what you decide to do. So make sure you take pictures of them and use this as your chance to really show off all your learning about the Great Fire of London. Can't wait to see them.